of fiddling, but it's intelligent, guided fiddling. And if you actually try to replicate that with a randomized controlled trial, you can't, because the dimensionality is too large. And I could talk about that technically, but I'm not going to. So seeing into the machine, as I call it, allows a village, the ministry, or the planning commission to make a better choice. It may be able to see whether it would work for them. They can see places where they could adapt it and make it better. And understanding the process and how it would work is the way that you go ahead. So there's no substitute for trial and error, local knowledge, and hard thought. Experimentation is obviously a good idea, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a randomized controlled trial. My friend Nancy Cartwright, with whom I've been working on these issues, she talks about helping factors. And this is a very useful concept. It's that if something worked in one place, you have to ask yourself, what were the helping factors that made it possible for it to work? So we've seen an example of this already, which are the clinics in Mexico. If you have a conditional cash transfer in India where there are no clinics, or very few open clinics, then that's not really going to help, and you're not going to get the same result. You know that in advance. That's an example of the helping factor. What about causality? Do not RCTs reveal causality? They do. But it turns out this causality is not tremendously helpful. Now, for many social scientists, that seems a really weird thing to say, that causality is not helpful because we sort of worship at the throne of causality. But an example of the sort of causality I have in mind is the following statement. The house burned down because the TV was left on. Okay? That's a causal statement, in that if the television had not been left on, the house would not have burned down. It really is what caused it. But it's not in the slightest bit general, because TVs do not usually burn down houses. RCT would show this causal effect. So if you had a million houses and some of them left the television on and some of them didn't, the ones with the TV on will burn down more often than the other ones. So causal effect. But TVs need helping factors like bad wiring or inflammable materials nearby. And you have to know those helping factors for this to be really useful at all. And causality by itself is not worth very much. So we have to figure out what these things are. And I put another way, replication of RCTs is not very useful because you'll get different results in different contexts depending on whether the helping factors are operating. I wanted to show you this picture, which is a drawing by Rube Goldberg. I don't know how many of you can see this. And Nancy Cartwright gives this as an example of the sort of causality we're talking about here. What you have is a window on the left of the picture out of which someone's flying a kite. When the window is open, the kite flies in the wind. That pulls a string which opens the door on this sort of thing that holds cakes or whatever. Inside this box that holds cakes are a bunch of moths. The moths fly out and eat this shirt that's hanging there. When the shirt gets eaten, it becomes lighter, and it goes up in the air and lowers the shoe. The shoe comes on this lever. The lever switches on the iron, which is on a red flannel shirt on the ironing board. The hot iron starts to burn the shirt, and the smoke goes into the tree. When the smoke rises in the tree, there's a possum there, a sort of animal, a marsupial. It's living in the tree. It gets smoked out and jumps into the basket. The basket lifts the lid off the cage in which a woodpecker is sitting, and the woodpecker released from its cage sharpens the pencil. So this is called the new improved pencil sharpener. The knife that's hanging on the right there is there for an emergency. If the possum or the woodpecker gets sick and don't show up to work one day, you can sharpen the pencil with the knife. Now this is a strange machine, but it's entirely causal. And you can open the window to sharpen the pencil. If you build lots of machines like this, it might not work every time, but it'll work more times than when you don't have this machine. So it would satisfy a randomized controlled trial. But this is an example of the sort of causality you get from a randomized controlled trial. It's like the television burning down the house. It doesn't ordinarily happen. And it's not a very useful thing to know. No one would dream of sharpening pencils using a device like this. And when you see the results of a randomized controlled trial, you should bring similar skepticism as to whether this is a policy that should be used everywhere. So this, I think, is the last slide. There is an expanding literature on randomized controlled trials. Many of them run in India. And we now have enough RCT papers to judge their quality and then the evidence they find. Some of them are excellent, and some of them are terrible, which is just like other empirical papers in the literature. I don't think they're any better or any worse than other papers. But you have to read them skeptically. You have to ask, you know, what were the helping factors that made this work? Will those helping factors work for me? What was the sample size? Are the results credible? You know, all those sort of things. Was the sample on which the trial was run representative of the population on which we would actually write to do this policy? So these are exactly the same sort of questions that you would bring to any other study. There is no free pass just because they're randomized controlled trials. There is no hierarchy of evidence. And using the word rigorous evaluation as a code word for randomized controlled trials is really without justification. Rigor depends on the details of the study. And right now, in economics and in much of the aid literature, they're being given a free pass. And I'm not against randomized controlled trials. They certainly have their place. But they should not be given a free pass. And they certainly should not be used to automatically generalize from some tiny sample to the result being valid in the whole world. RCTs have no monopoly on rigor, and there is no gold standard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Angus. Before I sort of go over to the discussant, let me introduce him. Shekhar Shah is currently the director of the National Council for Applied Economic Research. And he's come here from the World Bank, where he's been doing things not directly, but around this sort of an area. He was here in Delhi before and was part of some of the discussions we had leading up to our decision to set up an independent evaluation organization. Indeed, we filled the independent evaluation organization with a person who if he had accepted it, he chose not to, would have been the best person to be here rather than Shekhar, and that's Abhijit Banerjee, and along with Asa Ducklow, the person, the two people who I think have made this the big thing. So we offered him, but he chose not to come. But I think just to put Angus's talk in the context of that decision, Angus was absolutely careful to say that the bad words in his textbook are rigorous. I would add to that gold standard or something, which just because there's a one shot, it works. I don't think Angus would go even as far as to say that RCT is, in general, no better than other ways of doing it. I think he would simply not elevate RCT to something beyond what it is. But I think much of what he said, especially in this first slide, which is the need for assumptions, a certain independence on causality, and keeping things simple, has very useful things at many times. And those are the things that RCT does. But I think it was a very, let me say, provocative for some and hilarious for others talk. on what now passes for the gold standard. Shekhar.
Thank you, Abhijit. So 10 minutes, I guess? Yeah. So when you follow Angus, even if you didn't really agree with him, his powers of persuasion are so vast that one inevitably is turned to his point of view, and I've seen this happen again and again. As it so happens, I myself subscribe to almost everything that Angus has put forward. This is born both out of a long life in the World Bank and also in more recent times a concern with producing evidence that actually influences policy. So I'm going to agree with him largely, and I guess the big question for us, and I hope then to be short so that we can have really a discussion with this very large and engaged, I hope engaged audience. Since I agree with a lot, I'm just going to extend his argument out a little bit and then end quickly so that we can actually have a discussion with Angus and amongst all of us. First, of course, Angus needs to come here more often so that he can actually push this point of view about why evaluation is really terribly important, and there is really no gold standard. In fact, it almost kind of goes against the whole grain of evaluation if you pick on something and say this, once it has this chapa on it or this brand on it, passes without much muster. So I think that this is a very important point. You've all heard the strengths of RCT work, the minimal assumptions involved, the fact that there is an absence of bias just in the way the experiment is set up, and of course you get to examine causality in ways in which it usually isn't possible in real life to do so. I think there's a broader turn in the profession and in thinking about monitoring and evaluation that's come about as a result of the emphasis on trials and experiments, and that really goes to the kind of assumption of flying by the seat of your pants that very often, and certainly having seen it from inside in the World Bank, but it's just not the World Bank, it's the Planning Commission, it's all over the world where policymakers think they're doing the right thing, they're well-intentioned, and lo and behold, you have a policy or a program. And we see a lot of that currently happening in India as well. So I think this thirst for knowledge, this understanding of what goes into good evidence and then good policy is something that I certainly think the kind of move towards trials and randomized trials has brought about. And I think that's a major factor. But when I think back about some of the key pieces of work that have been done in India in the last 2 decades that have significantly changed our view of what works or what doesn't, what should be happening, what creates accountability, what doesn't. And if I just were to focus on perhaps education or health, I see Jean-Rez here. Many of you would know the probe report that he and his team did in the late 90s, which really gave, for the first time, shape to public opinion about what's right about primary education and what's not working about primary education. Certainly didn't have any trials in there. The work that I myself was associated with for the World Development Report on service delivery, focusing on absenteeism in schools, and what caused absenteeism, the fact that it was an easy statistic to measure, the fact that it actually could be comparable across different districts, different regions, different countries, helped greatly to think about what's wrong with our public schools. And again, no randomized trials there. The most prominent example of this kind of evaluation that has shaped a lot of thinking in public life, in civil society and in the government, is the work of Pratham and the work on ASAR, the annual survey of education that they do, which again doesn't have a evaluation, a randomized controlled trial, but when you see a girl child who should be in 6th grade not being able to read a simple card and trying to turn it round and round to be able to figure out which way it reads, you know something is seriously wrong. And so again, here's another example which has moved policy and moved thinkers where we don't have randomized trials. And then of course, the report on the ICDS by Focus in the mid-2000s, again, is an example of that kind of work. And all of this goes to show that really, in some ways, despite the large number of PhD dissertations that have come out using randomized trials, we seem to be actually getting much more impact out of the kind of trial and error method, the kind of work that was embodied in the reports that I cited that seem to have had a much bigger impact. So that's just by way of example. And actually also see Bharat Ramaswamy here. He did a very nice paper on looking at the leakages out of PDS, comparing the Indian PDS with the Philippines program that is similar. Again, no RCTs there, but really a great deal of careful work that suggested what's wrong with our food distribution and our food security system in both countries. Let me just point to some of the larger issues that I think are happening as a result of accepting something as a gold standard, something that by its very nature is not bearing as much scrutiny as everything else. And I think one factor here is crowding out. I think in the we are seeing instances where researchers are turning down opportunities to evaluate public programs when randomization is not feasible. I think that's a very strong knock-on effect of this focus on a implicit acceptance of the RCT approach. Doctoral students are searching for something to randomize. That's again, I think, a very bad effect of this narrow focus on RCTs. Sometimes donors are unwilling to fund non-experimental evaluations. Even the World Bank is responding, having been criticized for a long time for not doing enough social experiments in their lending operations. And I guess one of the largest trust funds that the bank has been focused primarily on randomized controlled trials. So I think there are these crowding out effects that we need to be particularly sensitive to in the context of moving the evaluation frontier out. The second set of issues here relate to implementation. And in a sense, that's implied in the things that Angus also mentioned. Questions such as, do programs work well when they are implemented by a weak bureaucracy or a conflicted bureaucracy rather than university-trained researchers? I think that's a very important question that we have to think about, and I'll come back to that in a second. Issues of scale. Who will be responsible for kind of implementing a program that seems to have had an RCT that's showing us good results? What are the incentives to perform? So I'm thinking of the institutional sort of envelope around the kind of policies that RCTs may show seem to have good results in small-scale experiments. But then if we don't understand why they work, and it goes to the larger question of why they work, if we don't understand the issues of incentives, if we don't understand the issues of accountability, if we don't understand the issues of voice, if we don't understand the issues of management, these things then make it very difficult to think about how these kinds of programs, when they're taken to scale, will be implemented. So I think there are these large number of, there's also a question of entry point. As Angus has emphasized, we know what happens, but we don't know why it happens. And if you don't know why it happens, typically you don't have a good idea of the entry point for that particular policy. And in many ways, politics and the choice of good policies and programs is a question of finding the right entry point that is going to, at various points in time, have enough political support that you'll be able to sustain that kind of a policy. So I think there are these implementation and design issues that also come back to us. Let me end with just this sense, which